Welcome to the Bernie's Bootlegs podcast, where we explore the stories of successful musicians and share their perspectives on being an artist in a digital age. I'm your host, Kenny McCabe, and let's get into the show. Okay, guys, I'm here with Justin Robinson. Justin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So you have obviously played with so many different people, Roy Hargrove especially, I definitely want to touch on in a little bit. You've been all over the world playing the saxophone, playing music, but just to start out this conversation, I'd love to just give the audience some context about you, just in terms of where you grew up and how you got started playing music.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up between Brooklyn and Queens. Queens, more likely is where I claim more than anywhere else. I started playing saxophone actually because my father played, amateur. He played for a while, like in bands in North Carolina growing up. But he left and went to the Navy for about 8 years, and then came back. He basically did it as a hobby, and but I just loved it. And we had these like pictures in my house of Charlie Parker, and I used to just as a kid used to be so fascinated by them, like how he stood and how majestic it looked to me, like the way he would hold the horn and the ease of the way he looked in those pictures,
Yeah, there's definitely something kind of almost mystical about his aura. Like, he's someone that I would have loved to meet just to see what he was like, because such a legend. And
yes,
I'm sure he spent, obviously there's so many tales of him spending 16 to 18 hours a day practicing.
yes.
So I always, and a lot of times too, I always wonder what these people would be like, some of the great legends of the music to actually just talk to, have a conversation with. So was that basically from your father's influence that he was really into that kind of music?
Oh, both of my parents, they were huge jazz enthusiasts. So we had a lot of records, and the music was always on in the house, and my father, once I started playing, he would start pointing out certain things about Jackie McLean, who was his favorite guy, because also he had a chance to be around him in the 60s when he first, got home from the Navy and moved to New York, and he lived on the Lower East Side. So he'd go around, he heard groups with Hank Mobley, Wayne Shorter, but one guy that stood out to him, and also, he was easy to talk to, was Jackie McLean.
Yeah, so, he's another just amazing guy and amazing musician. And so I'd love to just get some a little bit of context from you about what it was like growing up in Queens and in the city, because there must have been, I would imagine, a lot of great opportunities to see really high level musicians. And this would have been the 80s?
Yes, these were the 80s, actually, the mid to late 80s, in terms of the experiences that I had that really stood out in terms of helping me to develop. I met Barry Harris, George Coleman, Bobby Watson, Frank West, Mr. Jimmy Heath, and all these great musicians during that time period. The period, I guess, between 1985 to 1992-ish. I laid a lot of the groundwork for my development in those years.
Yeah, and just around that time too, there's just so many legendary stories of all the clubs that were around at that time that are pretty much no longer around. Sweet Basil definitely comes to mind, although way before my time. But what were some of the clubs that you were being able to frequent at that time?
Oh, there were actually quite a few clubs in Queens. I had gigs at one point, so many gigs, I didn't really have to leave Queens to do. There's a place called the Track Lounge. Of course, the Village Door was a meeting spot where a lot of great musicians used to hang. They had jam sessions most nights. And Gilly Coggins ran one of the best jam sessions at that time. And he was also a neighbor of mine. Him and my father, they were good friends. They used to play pool and stuff like that together. So I had a chance to be around him quite a bit as well. And so, the Village Door, there was another place called The Scene. Carmichael's was another wonderful place where a lot of the older great musicians used to hang that were native to Queens on Long Island. And then you also had the place out in Long Island, was a Sonny's Place, I believe, during that time period. And you know, you could play like in the southeast section of Queens, you could play almost every night somewhere, you know,
Right.
or you know, you do little gigs and host. You know, I met guys like Bernard Wright, Rodney Kendricks, the Fight Brothers, Michael and Alvin, and so many more guys that I can't even think of. At one point, I'm pretty sure that's where Marcus Miller even played a lot, because he's from the same general area. He just, he's
Hmm.
older. And he became famous so quick. So, but we knew a lot of the same people. Tom Brown was another one that comes to mind, who I wound up doing a few gigs with throughout the course of the years.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like
Mm.
it might be a bit much to call like the 80s and 90s like any kind of golden age, but I mean, there were so many clubs. It seems like you're saying, there were opportunities to play every night. Not that that doesn't exist now, because I think it still does to a certain extent, but there were also just so many legends, like you're saying, just so many legends that were playing and just in New York all the time. And so obviously you had the chance to meet a lot of these people that you're talking about, and
Yes.
I'm sure you would do the thing that everybody does when they're a younger musician just starting out. Ask them questions, like come up to them after the gig, see what kind of knowledge you could glean from them. But were you studying formally at this time? Like, what was your actual improvement towards the saxophone? What was that looking like?
Oh, well, I mean, I had a lot of teachers. Um, my first teacher who was actually like doing gigs was this guy who lives in New Orleans now, named John Bastinelli. But my first like high level pro guy was that guy, and then I met Frank West.
Hmm.
But his number was listed, and I guess in the Jazzmobile list along with Jimmy Heath and guys like that. So my mom actually called, and I took my first lesson with Frank West when I was like 13 or 14.
Oh, wow.
Can't even remember. Yeah. And we forged a friendship, that lasted until, the very end.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so, kind of looking back on your musical development a little bit, what do you think were some of the main things that you spent time on, whether it was just learning tunes and playing, or did you do a lot of transcribing? What were some of the things that you felt had the highest impact for improving at your instrument and in music?
Oh, good question. I mean, there were so many different levels, I guess, of growth at certain times, the things that I needed to address. I mean, I learned so much from Frank West and then Bobby Watson. And then also I had a chance to take a few lessons with Frank Foster,
Hmm.
which really kind of changed things up for me. When I first went to his house up there, it was upstate, like not upstate, but like New Rochelle or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
When you walk into his living room, there was just all these scores, like his piano, like he had a baby grand piano, then around it, with it's like these scores of I mean, hundreds of them, just all over in neat stacks. And then he had all these saxophone method technical exercises and stuff like that. It was just like, but just going into the house was just so overwhelming. Like how people have record collections.
Right.
That's how his manuscript was.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, just stacks, yeah, stacks of stuff that he was working on. And that really kind of blew me away. I was like, wow, this is what it's like.
Yeah.
you know? Hmm.
Exactly. And when you
Yeah.
see someone play and you see someone in performance, you're pretty much just seeing the tip of the iceberg. You're seeing them at that one particular moment in time, and you're really seeing all the culmination of the countless hours that is spent most of the time alone, like in a practice room or like in your home, writing and arranging and trying to improve on the craft. And so it must
Yes.
must it must have been like extremely kind of interesting, and maybe also a little bit terrifying. Like, oh shit, like this is crazy. Like this guy is really doing it. He's he is all in. You know?
He's creating, exactly. He's creating and doing stuff. And he would sit at the piano while he would give you these different things to work on. And same thing with George Coleman. I studied with him for a period of years as well, and it was the same kind of experience. And George is such a uh, technician,
Hmm.
master manipulator of the saxophone
Right.
that it would be like kind of in awe when he'd pick up his alto and he's like, oh, here's some things on Cherokee. He'd sit there, and write them out, then play them back, oh, this is nice, now here's some other stuff I have. And so you'd leave there like, okay, I have enough for the next like 8 years after one lesson, to work on.
Right.
Yeah. And then But I think that like in terms of my where I feel personally where I made the largest leap um, musically was the time period of about a decade where I used to go to Barry Harris's classes.
Hmm.
That for me was another experience. I guess the way he communicated things made stuff so clear to me.
Yeah, and
You know,
I
yeah.
never had a chance to go to one of his classes. I believe he's still doing them, isn't he?
Well, yeah, he just did one 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I gotta get
yeah.
to one
So
of those. But yeah, I mean, he's just on another another level. Honestly, it's just like the some of the
yeah,
things. I've seen a few clips, on YouTube and things like that of him explaining concepts, and you just listen to him speak, and you're just like, oh shoot, like this makes a lot of sense, but this is something I never would have thought of. Just the way that he's
right.
conceptualizing stuff.
Yes, he's has one of the great minds of the music. There's no question about it. I mean, and his ability to be able to articulate his thoughts to me was always. I mean, to this very day, it's mind blowing. He'll talk about the fifth and sixth bar of Cherokee, and he said, "Wouldn't it be nice if we started from the seventh, went down to the second, then up a chord or something like that?" You know what I mean?
Right.
It would be like this beautiful phrase. Oh, why don't we try to put it on the other side of the beat? It would be more beautiful that way. And I mean, he's just, I've been around him for the last maybe 25, 30 years. And he's not like when he starts off like talking about things, it's just coming from the top of his head. It's not like a prepared thing. Like, let me say, today we're going to work on Cherokee. We're going to work on these kind of things. You could be with him the whole day. He might be, bowling or doing some other stuff or just day to day. And then all of a sudden he sits down at the piano or starts talking about a song. And it's just like all this insight just coming off the top of his head, you know?
Yeah, super incredible. And so one of the topics that comes up frequently on the podcast is like jazz education and college and all these things because since the 80s and even before that, since like the earlier days, I guess you might say, like jazz education in like a formalized way has really kind of exploded. It's
Yes.
much more common to have a musician who has a 4-year degree or a at least a certificate from a conservatory or like other kind of formalized education, which
Yes.
in so many ways is so different from kind of the older school or older style education that you're kind of talking about from that era and before, where it's just like you just go over to the person's house, you just talk about stuff and a lot of hanging out, I'm sure, and also
Hmm.
just very very long and detailed kind of like mentorship, I guess is probably a decent word to describe it. Do you
I think
feel
that's pretty much the word. Yes.
Yeah. Do
Mentorship.
you
Yes.
do you feel like that still exists today? And if so, or if not, like what do you think can be done in order to kind of resurrect it? Maybe it's just not as visible because the college machine has just overshadowed it so much. But I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are, how education has changed.
Well, I mean, I didn't even believe that I would see like the kind of programs that I see now, and also just the sheer volume of musicians that I meet all
Right.
the time, which I think in the long run is going to be a very good thing. A lot of these guys are very young, and I can see the same kind of thirst and hunger in
Hmm.
them that I saw in myself. What I felt myself when I meet them. So it's like um, I think that it has its place, but something's going to be lost and something will be gained. I think in the long run. I can't quite describe. Like I don't have a negative or a positive feeling. I'm just more of an outside observer because it's so foreign to me to think about like I meet these guys that I have a master's from Juilliard in jazz or something. You know what I mean? It's like
Right.
if I met a guy like that, usually he was a composer and he was studying extensively like classical music and had an interest in jazz when I was coming along. But now there's all these programs and I mean the musicians seem to be very dedicated. And I've played in a couple situations where I met like some of these kids that are graduating or in Juilliard programs and stuff like that. And some of them, you know, uh, I think are going to be wonderful musicians and hopefully torchbearers for us. But in terms of like there's so much information out there now.
Right.
I don't know how they process it the same way. Like for me, it was the thing of learning a song. Um, maybe finding a rendition of like for me it was always Charlie Parker I was looking for, and I
Hmm.
would try to transcribe or learn those solos like Cherokee or there's a wonderful recording of Barry Harris playing "Is You Is" or "Is You Ain't My Baby" that was live at the Jazz Workshop.
Hmm.
I would transcribe those phrases, some of those beautiful phrases that he would play on something like that. And I just sometimes maybe I'd learn it in a few keys, that kind of thing. And we had the time to work on just one thing extensively. Where compared to like now, I mean, there's so much stuff out there that they have to cover, so many bases they have to cover just to even get through the curriculum.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely just a kind of an overload of information, maybe, and it's just and it's also all just immediately accessible. And so this kind of like ties into the whole conversation that's out there about technology and its effect on learning and music specifically. And you're right. It's just kind of like an overload of information. It's hard to process. And then, in a program, you're going to have things that are just demanded by the curriculum that, at least in my experience, and I'm sure this obviously varies from program to program, a lot of it is not going to be directly applicable to actually playing music. It's going to be more on the theoretical side, which there's nothing wrong with that. But oftentimes, I feel like some of the programs probably aren't as efficient as they could be in terms of teaching practical stuff. But I mean,
yes,
yeah, there's just so many factors because you have to consider like college bureaucracies and these people who are administrators and they need to have classes and a certain number of credits and all these sorts of things. But overall, I think that you're right in the sense that people are still excited to play. They're very, very motivated, like you're saying. It's just a matter of I feel like sometimes like the depth can be lost. So this is something that I think about a lot, which is back, around the time when you were growing up and before, basically you just had records and then of course CDs came later and cassettes and everything. And people have told me before, like, during the 70s and 80s, if you wanted to learn a song, you had to call up and you didn't have a record that had that song on it. Then you had to call up your friend and see if they had a record with that song on it and then borrow it from them. And then this whole process. And, oftentimes people will talk about wearing out a record or just listening to the whole thing, again and again and again. But with, Spotify and all these things and iTunes, it's so more common now for people to just play their favorite song from a record and then to just play it a few times and then move on to the next thing. But I feel like sometimes there's like a quality of depth that might be lost there.
Yeah, I guess I guess it's still new. So like 30 years from now, we have this conversation. It might be a total revelation of how important a lot of these things were. And I always kind of looked at this one saying that Bird it's a quote of his, at least it's credited. He's accredited with it's credited to him rather. I'm sorry. That he said, learn everything you can and then forget it when you get to the bandstand.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's the beautiful part of having the access because, traveling as much as I have throughout the years, the hardest thing was like making sure that I had music that was accessible that I wanted to listen to. So, when I first started out, we were carrying around cassette tapes.
Right.
And then the CDs came along, and then after that, it was the mini disc. Then it was like, wow, you could get all these songs on one little disc. And then the iPod came out. And like now, I travel in my phone. I have at least 8,000 songs, which is something I couldn't comprehend, years ago. So that part of the technology, I definitely love.
Yeah, there's definitely so many positive aspects of it. There's no doubt about it. And like you said, it's still new. I mean, it's not. This is just something that has completely changed our society. Like it's going to take us a while to figure out, how to balance everything.
And assimilate it to day to day, applicability. That's going to be the hardest part. But I mean, the fact that there's so much information for you to absorb, it's just I believe in just getting it all, and then when you hit the bandstand, just play, because it'll be there for you. The more things that you can draw from, the more depth of knowledge that you have, the more that you're going to be able to convey it to the audience.
Yeah, without a doubt. And so I would be remiss if I did not mention the great late Roy Hargrove, because you obviously had a lot of opportunities to play with him and record with him and tour and everything. And of course, gone way too soon. But I think it's safe to say he's cemented his legacy pretty well as one of the all-time greats of his instrument and the music, I would say. And so maybe you can just say a few words about Roy and working with him and maybe how you first met him and how your guys' musical relationship developed from there.
Yeah, the first time I met him, actually, I met him through his manager. He was on his way from Texas to Boston to audition for Berkeley. And I guess he was about 17 years old. I was running the jam session at the Blue Note at the time. So this is maybe 1988, I want to say.
Hmm.
Yeah, I guess it was 1988 or something like that. Um, maybe 87. Maybe 87 because I hosted that jam session off and on through it, but consistently from 87 to 90. And we became friends instantly because we had a mutual friend, Stephen Scott, and we had talked a couple of times on the phone. But the first time officially met him, he was like 17, and I heard him play, and I was like, wow, things are about to be a little different in New York, you know, you know, and we were good friends until the very end. Yeah, he was a great guy. The thing about it was that he was this kind of guy. He was a sponge. You know what I mean? Like
Mm.
he had one of the great memories. So if you showed him something, he would every now and then come up to me, "Hey man, you remember this thing that we used to practice with Stephen Scott?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "You remember it goes like this?" And he started playing it on the horn. I was like, "Man, I haven't played that song since like 1990. You remember it?" He's like, "Yeah, man." you know, that kind of thing.
Wow.
You know, yeah, he was. And that way he was something else. Like he just had this impeccable memory. Could recall, musical events and things that we experienced or transpired that I'd actually forgotten about. you
Yeah,
know?
and as well, I feel like his dedication to the music and playing was just so great. Up until the end, he was still showing up to Smalls at 2 in the morning to play tunes. It was incredible.
That's him. It's funny. I was just talking with I did some gigs recently with Steve Davis, and he was talking about I guess one of the times we were out on the road. It might have been he might have been, or we were out with the Dizzy Band. I'm not sure if I was there for that particular tour, or it could have been our tour as well with Roy's big band. But Roy is like, man, I know where this jam session is at. And we're in the south of France somewhere, so they go through all of these weeds and bushes and all this place, and they find a truck
Mm.
that has like a club inside, like a makeshift club inside
Oh
of like
wow.
a tractor trailer. Yeah, and he had a piano and everything, and they're like that. And he said like it's like the ultimate fire hazard. He said Roy played like the whole night, him and Roy. It was like
Wow.
a night off after we had been traveling like forever. I think I left him, like you guys got it, and you know those kind of things were not unusual. I remember being on the road with him. There might be some guy with like a little drum machine and a Casio,
Oh wow.
and Roy might play with him the entire night. you know, we'd be sitting at the bar like, okay, just watching him. He was a guy who loved music in such a way. It was so you take it for granted sometimes. That there's somebody who shares your passion, but in such a way that is so self-consuming.
Yes.
He was that kind of guy. It's pretty much. I don't think he thought too much about anything else seriously. You know what I mean? Other than maybe having a good laugh and watching a good comedy or something like that. He's
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely one of the all-time greats, and one of the things that we touched on earlier is just like younger musicians coming up, and of course, Roy when he first came on the scene was maybe 16 or 17, was already playing super well,
hmm
and of course there's going to be that next wave and continuous waves of like younger musicians who are really fired up about learning to play the music, and so what would be a few words of advice to someone like that who has the same kind of passion for the music and desire to improve? What's your advice for someone like that who's just trying to start their career and trying to make stuff happen for themselves?
I guess one of the best quotes in terms of that kind of thing. And also, I experienced it by hearing this guy play live. Was Woody Shaw.
Hmm.
I had a few chances to sit in with him. Actually, it's how I met Steve Davis.
Mm.
And also, he did a master class at Long Island University that I went to. And he said, like, don't just allow music to influence you directly, like just with the transcription and learning solos and things like that. He said sometimes let it influence you indirectly. He said he absorbed more of the feeling of a record of just listening to it than just like listening to it for like taking off as much as I can of it, like transcribing, learning the chords and stuff like that. Because sometimes, we lose sight of the feeling of the subtleties of the intuitive part of the music, which also gives its intangibles, actually
Right.
intangible things about it that we would all look towards, for the guidance. Because initially, the thing that usually we get from music is that feeling.
Right.
Whatever it is, even if it's a pop song or something you might remember from a girlfriend you dated or a movie you went to, and you get a special feeling. You don't want to lose that in the process of trying to like transcribe the minor six with the six in the bass. You know what I mean? Type of thing.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of transcription, I mean, obviously, notes and rhythms themselves are important. I mean, that's kind of like a very important part of music. But like you're saying, it's not everything. I mean,
No,
like the notes is just like it's almost kind of like the first step. It's just like, and then it's just like, in what manner are you going to play the notes? And then you have, you know, just more intangible things, exactly like you're saying, like feeling or like feel. Like what is feel? Like you can't really quantify it.
right, exactly. And that's the intangible thing about music, and that's what separates Louis Armstrong from some random trumpet player that you hear at a bar or something. It's the things that you can't put your finger on that make it special about his delivery. The feeling, the zeal of the music, the energy. The things that draw you to something initially. Most people who are fans of music is because they've been moved by something that they've heard. Before, whether it's for a person who doesn't play an instrument, or the consummate musician. You know.
Yeah, it's something that I hear all the time. People, on the podcast and just in real life, people, explaining kind of how they got into the music originally. And oftentimes it's just like, hey, I just heard this track of this person or I saw this person live. And at the time, if you're that young, you don't know what notes they're playing. You don't know like what like harmonically is going on in the tune. But you can tell what it is in a very kind of intuitive way. And like something about it kind of like jumps out at you, and you're just like, oh shit, like what is this?
Right,
Like
exactly.
this is awesome.
I know you know the story about Bird listening to some place and a jukebox that was on that had all these country songs, and they're like, "Well, Bird, you like this?" He says, "Man, listen to the words. These cats is telling stories. You know what I mean?" And that's sometimes what we lose sight of as musicians. It's like just enjoying good music for what it is.
Yes.
Music.
Yeah, and
Hmm.
I've been trying to be more open minded in the last few years, just about like genre, because obviously you spend a lot of time listening to just straight ahead jazz of like the 50s and 60s, but I really kind of, as I get older, kind of care less about genre, and as I get older, it's just music at the end of the day.
Yeah, but that's something I think if I probably drew anything from Roy's Roy's love of music was that, what I mean? Like a lot of times, he would just hear something and be like, "Oh man, what's that?" A certain, pop artist that may have one song that he thought was great or something like that. And, he still allowed it to influence him like it was the first time he was listening to music. He would get so excited about something he would hear,
Right.
you know, compared to like, oh, this is and this is not of the proper genre that I deem acceptable.
Right.
Yeah, he
And
wasn't
yeah.
that kind of person at all.
Yeah, it's something. It's a tendency, I'm sure that we all have to a certain extent to want to categorize things. Like you want to put labels on stuff, and to some extent, labels are useful because it helps you be able to communicate better, in some
Right.
ways. But at the end of the day, it's just like you can really box yourself in. So definitely want to, at least in my opinion, use labels sparingly. Is my
Right.
That'd be probably my take on it. But I
It's either good or it's
yeah.
bad. You know what I mean? That's the way I
Exactly.
look at it. Yeah.
Exactly. I think it's like a Duke Ellington quote, right? It's just like there's good music and bad. There's
So
only
yeah,
two types. Yeah.
yeah. If you have Duke or maybe Pops and probably all of those guys, Bird,
Right.
I know they probably looked at it the same way. It's like either it's happening or it's not. You know.
Exactly. And so I
Hmm.
would love to segue to talk about something that is not immediately recognizable to most people probably as similar to music, but
Hmm.
in my opinion is very similar in many ways, which is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I know that you've been doing for some time. I believe you're a brown belt, right?
Yes, yeah, I've been training for 14 years off and on. You
Right.
know,
And
yeah, yeah.
I've been training for a little bit over a year now, and I I had never imagined that I could be as interested in something as music, but in terms of rolling with someone or sparring with someone, there's so many parallels in my opinion to improvisation. You're learning techniques and you're learning these puzzle pieces, I guess. But then when you're sparring with someone or rolling with them, these things are you're not really thinking about them consciously. You're kind of just reacting and relying on muscle memory and responding to what they're doing. And so I'm just wondering, like, is that something that you feel has caused you to be interested in that sort of process as well?
Yeah, I grew up actually studying martial arts. I started, I guess, training. First time I was ever on any kind of mat or did any kind of sparring. I might have been 11, maybe 10.
Hmm.
Can't even remember. Somewhere around 1977 and 78. Somewhere around in there is when my first experiences with martial arts. And, off and on through the years, I'd studied other different forms. But I have to agree with you concerning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's very much like jazz in my estimation because of the fact that in each scenario there is a move that is applicable, but it may not work at that particular time for you.
Right.
It's just like, C7, we know the notes of C7, right? And we know that C sharp can also work and F sharp, but like putting them in certain instances, those are not the right notes to play. Just like,
Yes.
since you've been doing it for a year, I could talk to you about the butterfly sweep. A lot of guys
Yes.
love it. And then I know a very good black belt who doesn't like the option of using it.
Hmm.
And he's very successful. He's a very successful guy and, kind of a theorist in his way. And he told me, it's not one of his favorite positions, which I find shocking because, I know so many of the great guys like Marcelo
Right.
Garcia.
Marcel, yeah.
And yeah, their games are based upon the butterfly sweep. And now the guy who's been winning everything, I've seen him do tapes of footage of Gordon Ryan
Yes.
breaking down the different applicabilities that he likes about the butterfly sweep. And, so it's like, it can be subjective, but not at the same time because some of the best guys can do a move that you don't think is good, or another guy thinks that it's actually the breadwinner. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's yeah.
And it's
So
similar too, in just like everyone's gonna have a different style once you reach a certain point, and that style, in jujitsu is gonna be based on a lot of different things. It's gonna be based partially on your body type, on your height and everything, because some people can do things like people with shorter limbs. Obviously, kimuras tend to work much better for them, whereas like cinching up a triangle choke is gonna be harder. With like shorter legs,
right,
it's easier for people
exactly.
with longer legs, and just like in jazz, something that someone might think is the hippest thing ever. Someone else might say, "Oh yeah, I don't really care for that. I like to play this particular thing over this chord progression or whatever."
Right, exactly. And it also has the same way of well, it's not the same way because one is physical and the other is kind of more you know intangible or whatever because it's going
Yeah.
out into the universe. But like you've heard stories of guys like, oh, I can get out of anybody's triangle, and then they get caught by a guy who's not even known to have a great triangle. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's like that's the amazing part of it, and I know so many guys. And also I think the other parallel is like how good somebody can become in a short amount of time.
Hmm.
Like you see a guy and maybe 6 months later you take some time off and then you roll with the guy. He's like, you're like, man, this guy's gotten good.
Yeah.
And same thing with music. You go out, you hear a kid, or a guy one time, and then maybe a year later, he's like absolute monster. You're like, wow, where did this happen?
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's something that I've at this point, I'm sure I'm sure you
Mhm.
feel the same way, which is that like it's just in terms of like the art form of like improvisation and the whole thing. Like I can't see myself ever stopping at this point. Like in terms of jujitsu, just because
yes,
it's just for me. And I'm sure this applies largely to other martial arts, of course, but at least in terms of like the overlapping qualities of being deadly effective. In my opinion,
Yes.
it's the most effective martial art overall, for a real life encounter. I think that's safe to say. People will disagree with that, but I think that, the UFC 1 through 3 pretty much showed that until people started, introducing Jiu-Jitsu universally into their game. And then obviously it became a little bit harder, but, and then,
Well, that's the thing I think about jujitsu is like, in order to understand how to counter it, you have to study it.
yes.
There's no way around it. Like a wrestler could beat a boxer just by picking him up and throwing him down on the ground. You know what I mean? Or the boxer, catching the guy with the perfect right cross or left cross or hook or something. But with jujitsu, like unless you're lucky enough to maybe land the perfect strike on the guy, you don't beat him.
Yes.
You know what I mean? If he knows more than you, then that's one thing that I've definitely taken away from it throughout the years. You know,
Yeah,
and
and also just in terms of like the art form, it's just when you see two people, you might even not know anything about jiu-jitsu. You might know zero about jiu-jitsu, which is most of the world. But at least, in my opinion, if you are artfully minded or you're a creative person, if you just see two very very high level people rolling or like training jiu-jitsu or competing against each other, it's just a beautiful art.
yes, I definitely I agree 100%. I've had a chance to, it's been a long time, and my buddy and I, Bruce, we've gone around, we've seen a lot of different schools, and for me, I've gone to Brazil a couple of times and trained down there, and that's the thing you learn, like these really high level guys who are good, but they just make it look so beautiful, like
Yes.
an art. My coach and I, like when I watch him roll and stuff like that, it's just like, man, I wish I was that good. But then I don't train 3 times a day and stuff like that, so
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's just like anything almost, just like any kind of creative pursuit. The people who are doing it at the highest level, in a certain way, they're gonna make it look way easier than it is. Like you can
Yes.
see someone like Gordon Ryan or like Keenan Cornelius, like in the gi,
Hmm.
anyone like that
Or
that's competing at the
without the
highest
gi,
level, or
or
without the gi,
Keenan.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
That
yeah.
too, and they just make it
Oh,
look so effortless. But the thing is, they've been
mhm.
training twice a day for the last like almost
Yeah,
as I mean, they're younger guys. If you could
of
also look at
course.
someone like Andre Galval, who's been training jiu-jitsu probably almost longer than I've been alive. But
Yeah, yeah. He's probably one of the most decorated guys as well. Yeah, Professor Davo. And hey, just remember the European Worlds. I think was last week, right?
yes, yes, indeed.
The Keenan got caught in the absolute against Felipe Andrew.
I know he got
Yeah, caught in the
triangled.
triangle. Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about that. This guy is so accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, it just
Yeah.
goes to show that anyone can be submitted. It's just
Yes.
but it still is in a few ways. It's different than a striking art, because I've heard like Joe Rogan say this before, and it's just like if you could be the highest level boxer, you could be Floyd Mayweather or whoever you want to name, but if you get
Hmm.
caught off guard, a random guy on the street, anyone knows how to punch, and so you can easily, not
Yes.
easily, but let's say a 1 in 100,000 chance you could get knocked out. But
Oh,
the
definitely.
thing is, like in jiu-jitsu, there's no lucky triangles. Like the like
No.
you can't just triangle Keenan Cornelius like just by accident.
Exactly.
Like it's not gonna happen.
That's true. And also the difference in those stand-up arts, I think it always favors the athlete.
Yes.
Compared to jujitsu, you can be a great athlete and still be terrible at it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Of course it helps if you dedicate yourself to it and you figure your way into it, but it's not necessarily the prerequisite to be a great, a great, a great jujitsu practitioner. Like there's guys who
Yes.
don't come from you know, there are guys who don't come from a sporting background that excel in jujitsu. You know, then there's guys, you know what I mean. And then of course there are guys who were collegiate wrestlers and things like that. But that doesn't have to be the same. Where like the great athlete who starts boxing 9 times out of 10 in the first year he's going to surpass you.
Right.
Even if you've been doing it for like you could be boxing for 10 years and then you get this kid that's could have been a Division 1 basketball player or football player, and he just becomes dedicated to boxing. He'll just leave you behind.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
Yeah.
it's one of the only martial arts too, and where you can like where size almost doesn't matter. I mean, it matters to a certain extent, but look at Europeans like Mikey Musamechi, who's like
Oh
he's
yeah.
like a light featherweight. He's 135 pounds, but he competed in
That's with a wet gi. That's with a wet gi on.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And but he
He's an
competed
absolute
in
monster.
he competed in the absolute, and I believe one of his first matches was, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he was
Muhammad
like,
Ali.
well, Muhammad
Muhammad
Ali,
Ali.
but
Yeah.
before that there was a guy who was even bigger. He was like 350 pounds or
Oh,
something.
the super heavyweight guy. The guy
Yeah.
who actually beat Ali later on in an absolute as well. Yeah, that guy's, oh man, he's humongous.
Yeah. And
Yeah, I know he was wearing the blue gi, and yeah,
yes.
I forget his name. Yeah, yeah, the guy's, wow, he's big, man.
Yeah.
I
I
couldn't
mean,
believe that match. Yeah,
technique, technique.
ex exactly, man. And also, like we were talking about, you look at Ali, you could tell he's a great athlete. The way that
Right.
he's built and everything like that. And then, like you said, Mikey was just. He actually, I think he posted a joke on Instagram, right? He said, I didn't know it was legal to use your feet for grips."
Right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, but I guess that's probably like the greatest analogy, and that's something that backs it up, because I don't even think Mike has great vision, right? I think he's exceedingly nearsighted.
Yes, I believe he is nearsighted. He
Yeah,
wears glasses.
yeah, and I see him like sometimes when they're raising his hand, you can see him squinting.
Right.
I know it because I'm nearsighted.
Me too. I'm
Yeah,
also.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So that shows you, that you don't have to, be like a world class, like a Tiger Woods or Kobe Bryant type of athlete to excel at the sport of jujitsu.
Most definitely. And so, hey, Jiu-Jitsu is a topic that we both seem to be super passionate about. So we could talk
Hmm.
about it forever, but I would love to get back to music specifically and just ask you
Sure.
about your latest single, which is out now. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it and where people can find it.
Okay, I actually don't perform on it, but I co-wrote a song with this wonderful singer by the name of Renee Neufeld, who is part of that '90s R&B group called Zane,
Hmm.
and she also worked and was, the lead singer, and co-wrote, I guess, a lot of material with Roy with the RH Factor band. And I always was a fan of her work and stuff like that. So, the unfortunate situation with Roy's passing, I'm trying to comprehend everything that was happening. I wrote this song, but I needed a lyricist, and also I needed some help. I had the chords, but not a definite melody at the bridge.
Hmm.
And so, I presented it to my buddy Willie, and he had the same thought that I did. I wanted to see first if he thought that maybe Renee would want to be a part of this project. And she heard the song, she loved it, and it took her a while, but the night before the memorial, she finished the lyrics. And when she sang them to me, I was just like, just blown away by the lyrics and everything that she came up with.
Hmm.
So the name of the song is called "Something to Believe."
Something to believe. Right on. And
Yeah.
so,
Hmm.
hey, so people can definitely check that out. I'm sure they can just pretty much find it. You can probably just Google it, right, and find everything.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's on her. It's released as a single in her name, Renee Neufeld. "Something to Believe," and it's been getting a bit of play. I've heard it a bunch of times on WBGO here, and I just received some things through social media, which Renee is a lot more adept at finding stuff than I am there in that avenue. She sent me where it's been played in France and in England, so it's getting some steam, some legs underneath it.
Yeah, that's awesome, and it's always great to
Yeah.
see stuff getting playtime. I mean,
Yes.
and there's so much music being created today that I'm sure it must be super gratifying.
Oh yeah, definitely, man. It was just an idea and a feeling for me, in particular this composition, and to have it realized, to the point where we have it with strings and like a real production is really kind of, it feels rewarding, as much as it
Yes.
can as a musician. Usually, once you're done with something, you're already looking to the next thing.
Yes, definitely.
Hmm.
And so, we're a little bit into 2020 now, and still most of the year ahead of us, of course. And so, what do you have going on? What are you excited about? What's coming up?
Oh, well, in particular, working the song is one thing. I've been doing a lot of experimenting with things with some configurations. You know, doing some gigs at Smalls and working through a book of my own in terms of you know, some crash compositions and everything, and having everything come together conceptually. Doing some projects with Willie Jones III. We actually finished his record a couple of weeks ago, and been playing a lot with like two wonderful bass players, Gerald Cannon and Santi Debriano. I've been playing in Santi Debriano's band actually lately, and it's been a real pleasure and a joy, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Where is I know you have an Instagram account. Is that the best place for people to find out you know, where you're going to be at any given time? Where can people find it?
Oh, usually on Facebook, and usually I do try to advertise on Instagram as well. J Mass One, I think is my name on Instagram. Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, there'll be links to all that stuff
Yes.
in the show notes. People can go click through and you know, keep up with what you're doing. But Justin, this has been really fun. I have to be super grateful for speaking with me today and sharing your time.
Man, I thank you for, you know, reaching out to me, man. It's been a blast actually to get a chance to talk to you. And then I found out in the process, like some of my friends actually subscribe to your YouTube channel, and they're like, man, this cat is, you know, he's got like thousands of followers. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that you know, people find this. I hope we didn't lose too many people with the whole jujitsu nerding out, but you know, I'm sure there'll be some interested folks, and you know, the more more people we can get interested in it, I think the better. And you know, the same goes for everything you're doing musically. So so thank you so much, Justin.
Okay. Yeah, man. Thank you for having me, man. It's been a blast.
My pleasure. Stay on the line for 1 second. Thanks again.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you happen to be listening to this. And if you enjoyed the podcast, consider giving it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, please visit BerniesBootlegs.com. Thanks again, and see you guys next time.